Nice to see everyone. Go Irish. Friends, I'm so pleased to be able to welcome you this morning. I'm John Cavadini. I'm a member of the Department of Theology, and I'm the director of the Institute for Church Life. And here we are in our beautiful new building, Geddes Hall. And I'd like to recognize, actually, the presence of Mike and Sheila Geddes, who are with us today. Friends, I'm so pleased to be able to welcome you to this which is the very first lecture in a new series sponsored by the Institute for Church Life. So we're beginning a tradition here today. We've called it Saturdays with the Saints. And it occurred to us because right in this short span of time, end of September to October, we have the 100th anniversary of the birthday of Mother Teresa, celebrated even by a stamp from the Postal Service. And we have the canonization of a member of the Congregation of the Holy Cross, Blessed Brother Andre, and also the beatification of really the patron saint of Catholic universities, John Henry Newman. So we thought we'd put this together for this month and then extend the tradition to next year. The saints are those who stretch our imagination. They interpret the mystery of the faith with the medium of their lives. While emerging from the life of the church, the saints do not belong to the church alone, but are for all people. How could it be otherwise, since the Lord, whose image they bear, was the compassion and strength of God made incarnate for all men and women? The saints, by their witness to his love and compassion, allow us to see it anew. They are like lights in the world, as Pope Benedict has recently written, meant to help us imagine our own way into the hope and the love to which they bear witness. Against the temptations of despair and darkness that can sometimes seem so powerful in the world. Blessed be the Most Holy Trinity, blessed be God and his angels and his saints. Now it is my great honor and privilege, friends, to be able to introduce our speaker for today, Lawrence Cunningham, who is the John A. O'Brien Chair of Catholic Theology here at the University of Notre Dame. Larry is perhaps one of the best known and most beloved figures on our campus. Of course, he's well known for his acclaimed scholarship on Thomas Merton, for his work on Francis of Assisi, for his long-running column Book Notes in Commonweal magazine, his studies of Catholicism, of prayer, and his handbook on the saints. Could we find a better person to inaugurate a new series of lectures on the saints? No. And Larry is also well known for his busy speaking schedule, which has taken him all over the world and netted him 2 honorary doctorates. But it's hard to capture Larry's contribution to the field of theology, and most especially to our university community, just by listing these accomplishments, as impressive as they are. One would have to also peek inside his classrooms, eavesdrop on his many seemingly continuous conversations with students, read the wonderful dissertations he has directed, and most of all, be prepared to open up in the morning at DCO Commons, the coffee shop in DCO Faculty Office Building, where Larry's early morning conversation with all comers ranges over an astonishing breadth of topics and depth of understanding. Just sitting in DCO Commons every morning for half an hour and listening, one would earn a wonderful education without any tuition at all. Most of all, one would notice the warmth of spirit, the upbeat and always encouraging tone of the conversation, unfailingly interesting, unfailingly optimistic, and full of hope. Larry's new book allows us even a further glimpse into his own life's journey as a theologian, Things Seen and Unseen, Notebooks of a Catholic Theologian. Larry will speak to us today on the topic, ever ancient, ever new, the holiness of Blessed Teresa of Calcutta, on the 100th anniversary of her birth, and I all invite you to welcome Larry Cunningham to the podium.
Thank you, John. When they start calling you the most beloved figure, you know it's time to start checking your retirement accounts, I'll tell you that. I'm delighted to be here to speak about one of the most extraordinary people in the history of the Catholic Church, and certainly one of the signal persons of our age. Teresa of Calcutta was rarely given to autobiographical statements, but she did one time say the following, and it, in a sense, gives us a profile of her life. She said, "By blood I am an Albanian, by citizenship an Indian, by faith I am a Catholic nun, as to my calling I belong to the world, and as to my heart I belong entirely to the heart of Jesus." She was born on the 26th of August 1910 in Skopje, which was then a part of Albania. It's now part of that highly contested Balkan area known as Macedonia. If you were to take an automobile from Belgrade in old Yugoslavia down to Athens, you would pass through Skopje. It had an ancient history. It was one of the outer fringes of the Roman Empire. And the religious identity of that part of the world was quite fragmented. It had been in contact with the Ottoman Empire, so there's a sizable population of Muslims in Albania, in what was then Albania. It was in touch with Bulgaria, and hence it had a lot of people who belonged to the Orthodox Church, the Albanian Orthodox Church, and there were also Roman Catholics, and her family was Roman Catholic. She belonged to Sacred Heart Parish, which was under the care of the Jesuits. And while her native language was Albanian, she was also educated in the Serbo-Croatian language, which is the language of that part of the world. In September of 1928, at the age of 18, she left Albania to join the Sisters of Loreto, also known as the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary. They were in Ireland. And this was in fulfillment of her desire to be a missionary. A year later, barely 1 year into the congregation, she was sent to India, and after making her first vows, in which she was given the name Mary Teresa, her given name was Agnes, she did that in 1931, and then was assigned to St. Mary's School for Girls in Calcutta. She made her final vows in 1937, and as such became known as Mother Teresa. And in 1944, during the Second World War, and remember India at this time was still under the British Raj, she was named principal of the school where she had first been assigned. The critical date in Teresa's life, Mother Teresa's life, was September the 10th, 1946. She would often refer to this date in her life. She was taking a train ride from Calcutta up into the hill country of Darjeeling, where we get the famous Darjeeling tea. And she says that when she was on that trip, she saw for the first time the poor of India from that train window, and she received, as she once said, a call within a call. William James, the great psychologist of religion, would refer to Mother Teresa as twice born. And I can think of another great Teresa who had the same kind of experience, and that's Teresa of Avila, the great 16th century mystic. She entered the convent when she was a relatively young woman, St. Joseph's in Avila, and after nearly 15 years in the convent, she got sick and she went to recuperate with her uncle, and she received a kind of a second vocation that led her to become the leader of the Reformed or Discalced Carmelites. This is not an unknown phenomenon in the history of the saints. Evidently, on that date, September the 10th, 1946, and we know this from her posthumous letters, she had experienced some kind of a profound mystical insight which radically changed her for the rest of her life. And she always kept to the year she died, that September date, as a conversion moment in her life. Now, she tried to discern the meaning of that call. What was that call all about? How were you to make it concrete? How were you to make it into something that would give actual fulfillment to this experience that she had had? So with the permission of church authorities, 2 years after the September 46 occasion, she was given permission by church authorities. She was very close to the Archbishop of Calcutta, who was a Jesuit priest. She was given permission from church authorities to leave the convent, to leave the Sisters of Loreto, and to go out, as she did in August of 1948, with the determination that she was no longer going to be a European nun. Now that's a very important fact. That's why she adopts the sari, the white sari with the blue stripe, which is the characteristic of the missionaries of charity. She says in her letter that she did not want to be a mem. That's a shortened form of the word mem sahib. She didn't want that honorary title that Indians gave to Europeans, something the equivalent of your ladyship or something of that nature. She didn't want to be that. She wanted to be an Indian. And when the country gained its independence, as it did during this time, she promptly took out Indian citizenship. So the first thing she did was to go take a short course in primary medical care with the medical mission sisters who were in Patna, in India. Then she returned to Calcutta and lodged for a time with the Little Sisters of the Poor before beginning her primary mission in the slums. And she still didn't have a clear idea what she was going to do. If you read the original notes that she took and the original ideas that she set down on paper, and I actually, in preparation for this talk, did that, she had this idea that maybe you could gather up 10 or 15 children in the slums and begin teaching them to make them literate. So she hadn't gotten away from that idea that she had experienced as a teacher. Or maybe she could simply go and take care of the poor. Well, eventually what happened was that she began to notice people dying on the streets of Calcutta. And it wasn't out of indifference, as sometimes it is alleged in the West. It was because the hospitals were very crowded, and if they determined that a person was beyond care in the final stages of tuberculosis, or people that have had massive strokes, or whatever the case may be, they simply couldn't accommodate them in the hospitals, and they were left to fend for themselves. And so she began to take care of these people to the best that she could. Then an extraordinary thing happened. The city of Calcutta gave her an unused pilgrim hostel. Now the pilgrim hostel, ironically enough, was meant for Hindus who came to worship at the great shrine of the mother goddess Kali. Now, if you've ever seen a picture of Kali, she is depicted as a ferocious figure with blazing red eyes and fanged teeth and wild hair with necklaces of skulls around her neck. She was the goddess of death. But, and this is very Hindu, also the goddess of renewal and rebirth. And she gets this abandoned hostel and she begins to accommodate some of these people that she finds in the various slum areas. And she names this hospice for the dying Immaculate Heart, Nirmal Hriday. I'm probably mispronouncing the Bengali, but it meant pure heart or immaculate heart. By 1950, she had begun this work in 1948. She had a small cluster of people around her, and she was recognized by the Archdiocese of Calcutta locally under the title the Missionaries of Charity. Within that decade, she was already sending sisters who had joined her to other parts of India. In 1965, she got a decree of praise, as it's called, the Decretum Laudis from Rome, and for the first time, she sent sisters outside of India. I think the first ones went to Venezuela. In 63, between 1963 and 1976, she started within her own community a contemplative group, the Contemplative Sisters of Charity. And then she founded Brothers in 1976 and Missionary Charity Fathers in 1984. And she encouraged a group of co-workers, and in 1981 she established an affiliate for priests, ordinary priests that wanted to join in their particular charism. So the one thing, though, that she didn't like and always discouraged and said no to was anyone using her name to raise money. She did not like to have her name co-opted. I mean, she was this little, tiny, 4'10", increasingly bent-over sister who seemed only to be thinking about God, but she was tough as nails. In 1979, because by this time she was well known, she'd been on the cover of Time magazine, Malcolm Muggeridge, who lists one of the reasons that he became a Christian and a Catholic was encountering Mother Teresa, had written a widely read book called Something Beautiful for God. She won the Nobel Prize in 1979, and I think that it was very telling that she said on that occasion, amidst all those people with tuxedos on, something very profound. Calcutta is everywhere. Calcutta is everywhere. Anyone who's walked on the streets of South Bend, Indiana, or Chicago, Illinois, or New York City, or San Francisco knows that to be the truth. And she says, even in those places where people have everything of their material needs taken care of, they are not truly loved, and Calcutta is also in them. Presently, there are 4,000 sisters in 610 foundations. They're in Afghanistan. They're in Iraq. They're in the Palestinian territories. They're in Israel. They're in the city of Rome. They're in 123 countries. As you know, she died on September the 5th, 1997. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, or maybe it's an indifferent fact, she died the same week as Princess Diana. And the newspapers, of course, 24/7 were showing that the Brits don't always keep a stiff upper lip. There was this profound outpouring of affection and so on and so forth for Princess Diana. Within 2 years after her death, her cause for beatification started. If you look at the Vatican website that deals with her cause, they tend to list 4 reasons why she was conspicuous in her own age. I'd like to just say a word about each one of those. And then I want to make 3 observations of my own. And then I want to say something about these startling revelations about her that came to us a couple of years ago. And then I will stop. So hang in there. Those that endure to the end will be saved. The Vatican website says that, number 1, she exhibited in her life the joy of loving. The joy that comes from loving. And her mantra in this was, do something beautiful for God today. Do something beautiful for God today. Secondly, she taught the inherent dignity and worth of every human being. And she has often specialized in having her sisters take care of the mentally handicapped or the physically handicapped or the leprous and so on and so forth. But every human being, the most terrible thing for a human being is not to feel loved. Thirdly, like the little flower, Teresa of Lisieux, she taught the enormous value of doing the ordinary with fidelity and extraordinary faith. Doing the ordinary in an extraordinary fashion. I see a couple of my students and former students in this little audience, and they will recognize that I often say to them in class, the will of God for you today is to do your homework. Not to think about the future, not to think about all this other stuff. You gain the grace of God by doing the ordinary with fidelity. And fourthly, she taught that the love of God is a form of friendship modeled after the example of Jesus. She is perhaps the most profoundly Christocentric saint that I know of. So those are the things that the Vatican emphasizes. And I'd like to point out three other points that are my own little pathetic reflections. The first one is this. She illustrates, as well as anyone that I can think of, that the gospel, the Word of God, is not a text to be performed, but a program. Not a text to be read, but a program to be performed. I mean, her life was the performance of the gospel. And not the gospel in some kind of a vague, general way. She had a very specific take on a very specific text. Maybe the shortest text in the entire Bible. It certainly is in Latin because it's only one word in Latin, and it comes from John 19, verse 28. Jesus on the cross. I thirst. And she said, I wish to devote my life, and this theme constantly recurs in her letters, circular letters to her sisters, to her friends, and so on and so forth. She said, what I want to do is to satiate, to satisfy the thirst of Jesus manifested in the body of Christ. That's what I want to do with my life. To fulfill the thirst of Jesus as it is manifest in the body of Christ. Now here's a second point. This is another little Cunningham reflection for what it's worth. The gospel talks about the good householder who brings forth old things anew. Now, in my mind, there are two different kinds of saints. There are certain saints who get a notion about doing something that hasn't been tried before. Ignatius of Loyola almost had the Jesuits abolished because he had this idea that religious priests ought to be able to function in the world without saying the divine office in common. This was unheard of in his time. He didn't want to have a full liturgical life for the early members of the Company of Jesus. And a pope who actually belonged to a religious community not unlike the Jesuits thought this was a crazy idea and tried to force Ignatius to change that. But Ignatius said, no. Like the late Bear Bryant of football fame, he wanted the Jesuits to be mobile and agile. He didn't want them in in the community reciting the divine office in common. He says, let them take their breviaries with them and say them on their own. So he had a kind of as Karl Rahner once said, he had this idea that there's a new way of, the saints sometimes show us new ways of holiness, new ways of the gospel. They're innovators. Now, if you read a lot about Teresa of Calcutta, one of the things that you see very quickly is she was not an innovator. I mean, it is hard for me to think of a more traditional nun than Teresa of Calcutta. She was into adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, saying the Rosary, doing meditation after the mode of the Jesuits, and so on and so forth. And I've often said to students, you could have transported Teresa of Avila back 8 centuries, and she would have been doing exactly the same thing that she was doing in the 20th century. Her great gift was to show that there are fabulous resources in the tradition if you know how to make use of them and to understand them and to have a depth knowledge of them. She said to these sisters, you know, we're going to go out in the world, we're going to lead a life, we're not going to lead a life of, we're not going to become mem sahibs, we're going to lead a very simple life, we're going to say the Rosary, we're going to have meditation, adoration, we'll say evening prayer together, and so on and so forth, and we're going to do something beautiful for God. That's it. But what she did, to go back to something that the Vatican said, is that she did this in an extraordinary fashion, with extraordinary fidelity. And I think that in her life there's a kind of an apologetic argument for the thickness and the depth of the Christian tradition. Now, just a few years ago, this book was published, Come Be My Light, Personal Correspondence and Diaries of Teresa of Calcutta. This is not an expose. This was not going to make it onto the websites that want to bring down heroic figures. This was edited by the priest who's the postulator for her cause. But what he tells us is that from 2 years after she leaves the Sisters of Loreto and starts on her own voyage, she suffered extraordinary spiritual dryness that lasted right up until the time she died. I'm not going to read a lot of this, but let me just read. She shared this only with her confessor and with a bishop in Calcutta. When she would write, she would write sentence fragments and just have a dash. She wrote this: Lord my God, who am I that you should forsake me, the child of your love, and now become as the most hated one? The one you have thrown away is unwanted, unloved. I call, I cling, I want, and no one answers. No one. By the way, the one is capitalized, God. The darkness is so dark, and I am alone, unwanted, forsaken. The loneliness of the heart that wants love is unbearable. My God, how painful is this unknown pain. It pains without ceasing. I have no faith. I dare not utter the words and thoughts that crowd in my heart. So many unanswered questions live within me. I'm afraid to uncover them because of the blasphemy. If there be God, please forgive me for saying that, trust that all will end in heaven with Jesus. When I try to raise my thoughts to heaven, there is such convicting emptiness that those very thoughts return like sharp knives and hurt my very soul. Love, the word, it brings nothing. I am told God loves me, and yet the reality is darkness, coldness, and emptiness, and it's so great that nothing touches me. Before the work started, and there was so much union then, so much love, faith, trust, prayer, sacrifice, did I make a mistake in blindly surrendering myself to the call of the Sacred Heart? The work is not a doubt, because I am convinced that it is God's, not mine. But I don't feel, not even a single simple thought or temptation enters my heart to claim anything in this work. There are pages of this. This is 1959. You could cite similar things that she writes to her spiritual director in 1979. Now, what are we to make of that? Well, I think that anyone who... Here's what we shouldn't make of it. First of all, it's not depression. Depressive people can't act. This is the same person who is chatting with journalists, who is traveling all over the world, who is working day and night, who's faithful to her spiritual life, to that of the sisters, and so on and so forth. I think that the people who have helped the most to understand this is to call upon that great doctor of the darkness of faith, and that's St. John of the Cross. And St. John of the Cross, in his writings, and by the way, John of the Cross never uses the word dark night of the soul. Never occurs in his writings. John of the Cross says that as a person advances in the love of God, it is possible for two things to happen to them. The first is they feel a lack of any sensible satisfaction in the life of prayer. He calls this the night of the senses. And he says this is a passage through which everyone who wants to be closer to God must experience. And he says otherwise, he said, if every... Now I'm paraphrasing John here, obviously. He wouldn't use this language. If every time you say your prayers or every time you go to church you get warm, fuzzy feelings, there is always the possibility that the reason why you pray and go to church and so on is to get warm, fuzzy feelings. He says sometimes, you have to pass beyond that possibility of having some emotional satisfaction in the life of prayer. But he says, when you pass through that, God may ask of you as he draws you in love, to experience what John calls the dark night of faith, where the presence of God seems to be absent, where you are out alone with your own inadequacies and so on. And he says this is a great trial through which you have to pass. And John himself did not end with that darkness. It's commonly said he is the doctor of apophasis, of the denial and the night of the experience of faith. Actually, the last book that John writes is a book about light and fire and warmth, the living flame of love. And I think that if you read Teresa of Calcutta in the light of John of the Cross, you see that she's one of those rare persons whose faith was so deep and whose love was so unquenched that she could work with fidelity all those years without the sensible satisfaction of knowing that God loved her, at least knowing that in some visible way. She is not unique in this, and she knew that. She cites in her letters people I have read who have had similar experiences in their life. That gives her some consolation. The one person she doesn't read, and who would have given her a lot of consolation, is her namesake, Teresa of Lisieux. Unfortunately, during her lifetime, the story of the soul had been boulderized, cleaned up by one of Teresa's sisters. And that part of her story, especially in the last year or so of her life when she's suffering terribly from tuberculosis, was excised out of the text. But once we got the complete text back, we discovered that at times, Teresa of Lisieux, she said she had these terrible temptations that she had wasted her entire life, that that there was no God, that God was abandoning her, etc. And then she had to pass through that. Now, what do you make of all this if you're Teresa of Calcutta yourself? And I think that she gives us a little clue in something that she said one time. This is the penultimate thing I'm going to say, so hang with me. I'm going to be done in 3 minutes here. She understood this darkness, and one time she wrote this. She says, "If I ever become a saint, I will surely be a saint of darkness. I will be continually absent from heaven to light the light of those who are in darkness on earth." This is the way she read her own experiences. And this, of course, is, we theologians love to use this big language, this is a kind of a form of a kenosis, of self-emptying. I will give myself completely. Now the paradox, of course, is that the one who gives himself completely out of love is doing exactly what Jesus himself did. In the 1963, I believe, she was in Rome and she fell and she hurt herself and she was put in the hospital. I'm sorry, did I say 63? 1983. And while she was in the hospital, she kept a little notebook and she wrote this, and I will, I think, justly allow her words to end my talk. So she kept this little notebook and she wrote a question: who is Jesus to me? And it's like a litany. Jesus is the Word made flesh, the bread of life, the victim for our sins on the cross, the sacrifice offered at Holy Mass. Jesus is the Word to be spoken, the truth to be told, the way to be walked, the light to be lit, the life to be lived, the love to be loved, the joy to be shared, the sacrifice to be offered, the peace to be given, the bread of life to be eaten. Jesus is the hungry to be fed, the thirsty to be satisfied, the naked to be clothed, the homeless to be taken in, the sick to be healed, the lonely to be loved, the unwanted to be wanted, the leper to wash his wounds, the beggar to give him a smile, the drunkard to listen to him, the retarded to protect him, the little one to embrace him, the blind to lead him, the dumb to speak for him, the crippled to walk with him, the drug addict to befriend him, the prostitute to remove from danger and to befriend, the prisoner to be visited, and the old one to be served. Jesus is God, spouse, life, my only love, all in all, and in everything. Thank you all very much. John says that we could take comments. I know at least one person here in this room who has worked with Mother Teresa's sisters in Calcutta. Where's Mike Daly? And he's going back at Christmas time to spend his Christmas break. Is there anyone else here who's worked in Calcutta? You want to say something? I mean, I'm just an old professor. You guys
well, having the opportunity to go to Calcutta and to live and work and pray where Mother Teresa lived and worked and prayed just was an unbelievable way of understanding her mission, her faith, the depth of it, and to really kind of understand what she loved, which was to serve. And to be, we both stayed about 4 steps away from Mother's tomb. And we had the opportunity to go every morning, every single day, to go just sit in her tomb. And it's so simple and so humble. And that's that's how she was, was just everything was such humble, simple service and done with such extraordinary love, just like you said.
Come on, Michael, you are not going to sit there and be quiet.
My experience was also very positive and transforming. I think I worked at the Home for the Dying every day when I was there. You can work 2 shifts in the morning and afternoon. And I chose to do both shifts there because it's such a special place. And my mom always said, when a person passes away, it's where heaven and earth meet. And you really feel the presence of Christ in the Home for the Dying. And it's interesting because the Hindus are sacrificing to the goddess Kali and the goddess of death. And on the other half of the building is the Home for the Dying. And, all the sisters are sanctifying death. And Mother Teresa always wanted to take over the whole building, and so hopefully sometime soon it'll be all the Home for the Dying. But I think the special thing that I found with the sisters is just their joy and passion for what they do. The conditions are so difficult, just physically and materially. However, just the joy that they have that radiates in everything that they do is so contagious and so special. It's amazing. It's joyful suffering, and they really connect to Christ's passion and His suffering. And so, with their daily prayer life and adoration and everything, they really rely on Christ. And I think their work is so sanctified through their relationship with Christ that it can't be done without Him. So it was a good experience. And a quick story that one of the sisters told me, at the Home for the Dying, Mother Teresa, every time she entered, she would go straight to the toilets and clean the toilets because she would always want to do the work that no one wanted to do, and also to keep her humility. She never thought she was humble enough, and so and these toilets are more like gutters, I guess, that are very, very, very dirty. So she would always be the one to do the lowest work, I guess.
Mahatma Gandhi did the same thing at his ashram because traditionally in Indian society, only the outcasts, the people that were below the lowest caste, did that work. And that was a gesture that Gandhi made to show there is no distinction to be made between people. Okay, now listen, I have a little strategy that I use here. I'm going to pause for 20 seconds to see if someone will raise a hand. If no hands go up, I'm going to start calling on people. So everybody get ready. Yes, please.
Sir, I read in Mother Teresa's Secret Choir by the priest who formed her priest group, whose name is a senior moment right now.
I know senior moments.
That the I thirst was key in her whole psychology, spirituality, etc., and that she put it on the wall of every single one of her 661 institutions, and basically it meant that Jesus was thirsting for her, which gave her a great dignity, and Jesus is thirsting for each one of us. I wonder if you could say a few words about that.
That is in fact true. As I said during my little talk, it is the key text to which she goes to time and again, one of the 7 last words of Jesus on the cross. And she actually thought of her mission as flowering out from that phrase. By the way, there have been many books written on Teresa of Calcutta, and no one has asked, but I'm going to tell you which I think is the best. I've read a number of them, and I think one of the most wonderful ones was by one of the most saintly women, although born in Wales, lived all of her life in this country, and that is Eileen Egan, who was the great friend of Dorothy Day, and also knew Mother Teresa of Calcutta for 40 years. Eileen Egan worked for decades with Catholic Relief Services all over the world and was a committed person to nonviolence. And she lived to be 89 years old. And tragically, this great apostle of nonviolence was mugged in New York City on her way to church, and she died from the injuries that she received. But she forgave her mugger from the hospital for doing this. But Eileen Egan has written a really wonderful book on Teresa of Calcutta. And Eileen is also a kind of a heroine in my view. I'm always frightened when John Cavdini puts his hand.
No, I just had a question of clarification. When you talked about the call, her second call, that experience, did that have to do with that phrase from the Gospel, I thirst?
It didn't. It evidently, it is as if she had some great and sensible experience of our Lord. But she never described it fully. And at least from what I've read, it's not clear that the phrase "I thirst" was connected to that. But she evidently had some profound, life-changing experience that I don't know whether she did, but her interpreters tend to use the word mystical. Yes, sir?
There's been many volumes about the definition of grace, and all the distinction. It seems to me, just listening about her life, that she is grace incarnate, but would you think that's true? In other words, if it wasn't for grace of God, she couldn't do or live or persevere.
Right. Yes, absolutely. I've often said the difference between the philanthropist and the saint is that the philanthropist may burn out, but the saint never burns out. What's important about Teresa of Calcutta is not that everybody in the world knows her and we have postage stamps about her and that she won the Nobel Prize. But what is important about her life, the great lesson of her life, just as it's the great lesson of the life of Peter Claver or Dorothy Day or other people like that, is that she got up every day and did it. Every day. And she had to be sustained in doing that. And the ability to be sustained is a gift. And the synonym for the word gift is grace. Absolutely. No doubt about it.
Now, you talked about her experiencing this darkness at the end of her life. At the very end of her life, is there any evidence that she experienced God's love at that particular point in accepting her?
She didn't experience this darkness towards the end of her life. She experienced this darkness for nearly 40 years. From within 2 years after she left the Sisters of Loretto and began her enterprise, and she had these first followers, and then this began to take over in her spiritual life, and it was kind of unremitting, at least as we know it from archival material, from letters and so on that she would write. She died a happy death, and that's attested to in the book. But she didn't receive a lot of consolation in her life, and this correspondence in this book tracks that out over a 40-year period. She begins to talk about this as early as the very early 1950s, and that goes on until 1997 when she dies. But she keeps going. Now, let me make a little professorial warning. This is a very interesting book. It's kind of a scary book to read, but it's extremely informative. I think that the man who wrote this book, who was her postulator, depended too much for his analysis of her experiences on a kind of an academic, scholastic understanding of the phenomenon of the Dark Night. He's very indebted to an old Dominican named Garrigou Lagrange, who loved to kind of divide these states and give examples. And I think that the analysis, especially in the notes, most people don't read the notes, professors read notes, tends to be a little bit overly schematic, but I do think that it is fair to say that she is a kind of a textbook example of the kind of stuff that John of the Cross wrote about in his great treatises, especially after the ascent of Mount Carmel in the Dark Night, the Spiritual Canticle, and the Living Flame of Love. Anybody else? Yes, please.
Larry, she was obviously very dedicated to Jesus. Were there any saints that had a meaningful impact on her?
She read the lives of the saints. She was constantly reading them. She refers to these kind of lives of the saints in order to kind of find clues about her own spiritual experiences. But she doesn't, it's not like she has a panoply of these. One of the things that is really interesting, if you look at what we have from her writings, is that her spirituality is profoundly Christocentric. You see very little spirit language in her writings. And to her, I think she shares this a little bit with St. Francis of Assisi. It's the Jesus of the Gospels, of the Synoptic Gospels and the fourth Gospel that really attracts her. In other words, it's hard to think of, well, I can think of a few, but she certainly is one who, she's a fundamentalist in the best sense of the term. She takes that 25th chapter of Matthew, where you're going to find Christ is going to be in the poor and the thirsty and the homeless and the prisoners and whatnot. She's a Matthew 25 lady, if there ever was one, and that's the way she tends to say things. Also, and this is uncharacteristic of Catholic writers up till the time of the Vatican II. I don't know if any of you all noticed this. She doesn't use Christ language, she uses Jesus language. Yeah? As a kid growing up in the South, that always sounded to me a little bit Baptist. But she focuses on this Jesus of the Synoptics and the glory of Christ in John's Gospel.
Friends, maybe we have time for one more question.
And there it is.
I was very privileged to attend Mass with Mother Teresa a number of years ago, and she didn't touch me, but she touched the person I was with. And I was so impressed after communion at her humility. She came into the center aisle, and she just kind of she was such a little person. We were all like standing, like on our tiptoes trying to see her. She was so tiny. But after communion, she just kind of collapsed.
Where was this?
In Newark, New Jersey.
Oh, Newark, New Jersey.
And she was just, prostrate on the floor in adoration after communion for just the longest time. It was just profound to be in her presence.
Thank you. I'm going to end you. I'm going to give you a nice story to make you think of a happy, wholesome Mother Teresa. She was a woman very much given to poverty, personal poverty, and once her order grew, she had to travel all over the world, and she hated buying airline tickets, paying for all these expensive airline tickets. She wrote to the director of Air India and said she had to travel. She always traveled Air India. Could she work as a stewardess on a free flight? Now, I want you all to imagine Mother Teresa about 4 pushing that cart down the aisle. People needed coffee or tea. Air India returned with a lifetime pass. Thank you all very much.
Friends, thanks for coming. We have 2 more installments in this series. One is next week on Brother Andre and St. Joseph. And then the October 30th meeting is Cardinal Newman. And that will be still a week. We'll sit right now. Well,